The heavy iron handcuffs slammed onto the wooden table with a brutal, deafening clatter, shattering a glass plate into jagged shards. Sheriff Vance Garrick leaned his massive, sweat-stained frame over the booth, his face twisted in pure, unadulterated malice, as he spat his venom directly into the face of the calm black woman sitting before him. "A captain's uniform? Who did you steal this from, girl? Or did you buy it at a Halloween thrift store so you could feel like a real human being for once in your life? In my county, the only thing people like you command is a broom. My jail always has a dirty cage ready for street trash like you." He didn't know that the quiet woman in front of him held the power to dismantle his entire life. He didn't know that within the hour, the sky would split open with vengeance. Do not miss a single second of this jaw-dropping story. Comment your current location and local time below right now, and hit that subscribe button to watch absolute justice unfold. The morning sun over Blackwood County, South Carolina, did not look dangerous. It cast a warm, deceptive glow across the cracked asphalt of Interstate 95, a long stretch of highway where out-of-state drivers rarely stopped unless their gas tanks were completely empty. The air was thick with southern humidity, the kind that stuck to your skin the moment you stepped out of an air-conditioned room. For Captain Maya Vance, this highway was supposed to be a peaceful path back to her roots. She was driving a pristine, dark blue sedan, keeping her speed at exactly 65 miles per hour, her hands relaxed on the steering wheel. She was a woman built on discipline tall, with a posture shaped by years of military drilling, her dark skin reflecting the bright morning light. Maya was an elite logistics coordinator for the United States Army, a decorated veteran who had spent the last decade managing high-level supply chains directly under the Pentagon's Joint Chiefs. But today, she wasn't wearing her crisp olive-drab uniform or the gleaming oak leaves of her rank. She wore a simple charcoal gray polo shirt, comfortable blue jeans, and a pair of silver-rimmed reading glasses pushed up on her braided hair. She was just a granddaughter, traveling home to visit an ailing woman in a quiet hospital bed. But Blackwood County had its own rules, and those rules were enforced by a man who viewed the county line as the border of his personal kingdom. Sheriff Vance Garrick had ruled this territory for 3 consecutive terms without a single challenger dare to put their name on the ballot. His face looked down from a rusted billboard near the exit ramp, accompanied by bold, fading letters that claimed he kept the county safe. In reality, safety depended entirely on the color of your skin and the zip code on your registration. Garrick was a heavy, barrel-chested man in his late 50s, his uniform always sharply pressed, but his heart long since rotted by unchallenged authority. He sat in his parked cruiser beneath the shade of a massive oak tree, his mirrored aviator sunglasses reflecting the passing traffic like twin shields of absolute power. Beside him sat Deputy Tyler Briggs, a younger, eager reflection of his boss's malice, always hungry to prove he could be just as ruthless. When Maya's sedan passed the oak tree, Garrick's jaw tightened. He didn't see a decorated soldier. He didn't see an American citizen. He saw an unfamiliar black woman driving a modern, expensive car with North Carolina license plates. To Vance Garrick, that was an immediate provocation. Without a word, he shifted the cruiser into drive, slammed his foot on the accelerator, and pulled up directly behind her vehicle. The sudden, aggressive flashing of blue and red lights filled Maya's rearview mirror. She didn't panic. She checked her speedometer again exactly 65. She activated her turn signal, moved carefully toward the shoulder of the highway, and brought the sedan to a perfect, controlled stop on the gravel. Garrick stepped out of his cruiser, his heavy leather duty belt creaking under the weight of his sidearm, taser, handcuffs, and radio. He took his time walking toward Maya's window, his boots making a deliberate crunching sound on the gravel, a psychological tactic designed to make drivers sweat. He didn't unhook his sunglasses. He kept his hands resting heavily on his pistol holster. When he reached the driver's side window, Maya rolled it down completely keeping both of her hands clearly visible on the steering wheel, just as her father had taught her to do decades ago. "License and registration," Garrick barked, his voice dripping with casual hostility. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't explain the reason for the stop. "Good morning, officer," Maya replied, her voice remaining perfectly level, a calm contrast to his aggression. "May I ask why I am being pulled over today?" Garrick leaned down, his face inches from the window, allowing Maya to smell the stale tobacco and bitter coffee on his breath. "You'll ask questions when I tell you to ask questions, girl. Right now, you'll hand over your documentation before I drag you out of that seat for non-compliance." Maya did not flinch. She reached slowly into her glove compartment, pulled out her registration, and slid her driver's license from her wallet. Garrick snatched the papers from her hand so violently that the edge of the paper cut the air. He stared at the documents, his eyes narrowing as he saw her clean record. He was looking for a fight, not a routine traffic citation. Failing to signal 300 feet before changing lanes, Garrick stated flatly, "Fabricating a violation out of thin air. That's a serious offense in my jurisdiction. People from out of town seem to think they can treat our roads like a racetrack." "Sheriff, I activated my signal well before I moved into the right lane," Maya said, her eyes locked onto his hidden gaze. "I am fully aware of the traffic laws." Garrick's face darkened, a dangerous vein pulsing near his temple. He hated the lack of fear in her voice. He expected trembling hands, stuttering excuses, and begged pleas for mercy. This quiet, unshakable dignity was something his authority could not tolerate. He turned back toward his cruiser, where Deputy Briggs was already stepping out, watching the exchange with a twisted grin. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Garrick muttered, turning his back on her window. "We'll see how smart you feel after we take a closer look at your business in my town." Maya watched him walk away in her side mirror. She felt a cold knot of dread form in her stomach, not for her safety, but for the sheer, unchecked injustice of the man. She knew she needed a public space, a place with witnesses and cameras. She started her engine, pulled back onto the asphalt slowly, and drove toward the nearest exit ramp, where the neon sign of a local diner blinked in the distance. Garrick's cruiser immediately accelerated, tailing her like a predator, chasing its prey into a trap. The neon sign of Miller's Oak Grill hummed softly in the morning heat, its faded red letters casting a dull glow over the gravel parking lot. The diner was a staple of Blackwood County, a place where local farmers, truck drivers, and retirees gathered to drink burnt coffee and discuss the weather. Inside, the air smelled of sizzling bacon grease, maple syrup, and old vinyl booths. Arthur Miller, a quiet white man in his late 60s with calloused hands and a faded apron, stood behind the laminated counter, slowly wiping down the same spot with a damp rag. He knew everyone who walked through his door. He knew their names, their families, and their secrets. When Maya Vance pushed through the glass door, the small brass bell above it jingled once. The entire room seemed to pause for a fraction of a second. She was an outsider, and in a small town like this, an outsider was always a spectacle. Maya walked calmly toward a booth near the large front window, carrying her canvas travel bag over her shoulder. She sat down, setting her notebook on the wooden table, her movements precise and unhurried. She chose this place because it was public. She needed the presence of other human beings to serve as a shield against the erratic malice of the lawman behind her. Within 30 seconds, the brass bell didn't just jingle, it rattled violently against the glass as the door was thrown open with immense force. Sheriff Vance Garrick strode into the diner, his heavy boots striking the linoleum floor like a rhythmic declaration of war. Deputy Tyler Briggs followed closely behind, his hand resting conspicuously on his service weapon, his eyes scanning the room to ensure no one dared to interfere. Garrick did not look at Arthur Miller. He did not look at the regulars who immediately lowered their forks. His eyes locked directly onto Maya, the only black woman in the establishment. The atmosphere inside Miller's Oak Grill shifted instantly. The casual chatter died. The clinking of silverware stopped. The entire room fell silent, the air turning heavy and suffocating as the two large, armed men marched toward Maya's booth. Garrick stopped right at the edge of her table, shadowing her completely from the sunlight pouring through the window. "Did you think you could run from me, girl?" Garrick shouted, his voice booming across the small restaurant, ensuring every ear was tuned to his performance. "In my county, when a flashing light appears behind your vehicle, you stay exactly where I put you. You don't get to choose where you stop." Maya looked up from her notebook, her expression completely unreadable. Her silver-rimmed glasses remained on her forehead, her eyes steady and clear. I pulled over on the shoulder. "Sheriff, I provided my documentation. I then moved to a safe, public location because your conduct on the highway was visibly aggressive. I am a paying customer here, and I have committed no crime." Garrick laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that rattled the coffee mugs on the counter. He slammed both of his large, thick hands flat onto the edge of the wooden table, leaning in so close that Maya could see the broken veins in his nose. "A paying customer? Look around you. You think a nice shirt and a clean car make you belong here? You're nothing but a trespasser in my town." From behind the counter, Arthur Miller froze, his rag stopping mid-stroke. He looked at Garrick, then looked down at the floor, his jaw tight. He wanted to say something, but he had spent his entire life watching Vance Garrick destroy men who stood in his way. He remained silent, a silent accomplice to the humiliation unfolding before him. Garrick reached across the table, his fingers clawing toward Maya's canvas travel bag. "Hand over everything you have. Pockets empty, bag open, now." Maya placed her hand flat on top of her bag, her fingers firm, her grip unmovable. "You do not have a warrant to search my personal property, Sheriff. I have a constitutional right to protect my belongings from unlawful seizure." Deputy Briggs stepped forward, his face twisting into an aggressive sneer as he reached for his handcuffs. "You hear that, Sheriff? She wants to talk about constitutional rights. She thinks she's a lawyer from the big city." Garrick's ego was pushed past its limit. He could handle fear, he could handle anger, but he could not handle a black woman looking him in the eye and calmly denying his absolute power. He straightened up, his chest puffed out, his hand moving down to grip the handle of his heavy baton. "Let me explain something to you, girl. Out there, in whatever city you crawled out of, you might think those words mean something. But in Blackwood County, I am the Constitution. I am the judge. I am the jury. And right now, your rights are exactly whatever I say they are." Maya kept her hands flat on the table, her breathing slow and controlled. She knew every word he spoke was a violation of federal law, but she also knew that in this moment, she was completely isolated in a room full of people who were too terrified to breathe. The suspense stretched through the diner like a taut wire, waiting for the spark that would blow the entire room apart. The rejection of his authority inside a crowded diner was a humiliation Vance Garrick could not endure. He needed to reassert his dominance, to show every resident of Blackwood County that no one could challenge the uniform. He reached out with his massive arm and violently grabbed Maya's canvas travel bag, ripping it from her grasp with such force that the straps snapped with a loud crack. He threw the bag onto the center of the counter, where it struck a stack of glass plates, sending them crashing to the floor in a chaotic explosion of ceramic shards. "Search it, Briggs," Garrick commanded, his voice cold and venomous. Deputy Briggs immediately descended upon the bag like a vulture. He unzipped it violently, dumping its contents onto the counter for everyone to see. Clothing, a travel toothbrush, books, and her personal wallet tumbled out. Among her items, Briggs's hand wrapped around a small, heavy velvet box. He flipped it open, revealing a gleaming bronze star medal, an honor earned through blood and sacrifice in the deserts of the Middle East, alongside a small, creased photograph of Maya standing beside her elderly grandmother's hospital bed. Garrick snatched the box from Briggs's hand. He stared at the medal, then let out a repulsive, mocking laugh. He tossed the sacred military honor onto the dirty floor, raising his heavy leather boot and stamping his heel directly onto the metal, crushing the velvet box into the linoleum. A captain's uniform? Who did you steal this from, girl? Or did you buy it at a Halloween thrift store so you could feel like a real human being for once in your life? In my county, the only thing people like you command is a broom. My jail always has a dirty cage ready for street trash like you. The words echoed through the diner like physical blows. Maya's face remained still, but her eyes darkened with an intense, quiet fury. The insult to her service, to her country, and to her family was a line that could never be uncrossed. "Stand up," Garrick ordered, pulling his heavy iron handcuffs from his duty belt. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct, resisting an officer, and operating a vehicle with intent to evade." "I have not evaded anyone, Sheriff, and I have remained perfectly orderly," Maya said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "You are fabricating charges because your pride is wounded." "I said get on your feet!" Garrick roared. Before Maya could move, Garrick grabbed her upper arm, pulling her violently out of the vinyl booth. Deputy Briggs lunged forward, grabbing her other wrist and slamming her face down onto the wooden table. The remaining coffee cup tipped over, sending a dark, boiling wave of liquid spilling across her notebook and dripping onto her pants. Maya did not scream. She did not struggle. She knew that any physical resistance would give them the excuse they wanted to use greater violence. She allowed them to pull her arms behind her back. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit deeply into her skin as Garrick twisted the key, locking them far tighter than regulations allowed. "You think you can come into my town and look down your nose at me?" Garrick hissed in her ear, his grip tightening on her cuffed wrists as he yanked her upright. "My jail has a special place for people who don't know their station. You're going to rot in a dark cell, and by the time I'm done with you, you'll be begging for mercy." Arthur Miller stood behind the counter, his hands trembling so violently he had to grip the edge of the metal sink to stay upright. He looked at the crushed velvet box on the floor, the broken plates, and the dignified woman being dragged toward the door like an animal. He wanted to scream at Garrick to stop, but the sheer terror of the sheriff's systemic power kept his throat completely dry. Nobody moved. Nobody dared to breathe. The regular customers kept their eyes locked onto their tables, completely ashamed of their own silence, yet too paralyzed by fear to stand up for justice. Garrick shoved Maya toward the glass door, her shoulders jarring against the frame as Briggs pushed her from behind. They paraded her out into the bright, suffocating South Carolina heat, her hands bound, her personal items left scattered and broken on the diner floor. Garrick threw open the back door of his cruiser, shoving her head down as he forced her into the narrow, plastic cage of the back seat. He slammed the door shut, the heavy thud sounding like the closing of a coffin lid. As the cruiser accelerated out of the gravel lot, its sirens wailing in a twisted celebration of stolen power, Maya looked back through the wire mesh screen, her spirit completely unbowed, waiting for the true storm to arrive. The concrete walls of the Blackwood County Jail were cold, smelling of old bleach, damp stone, and decades of industrial paint. It was a miserable structure, built in the late 1970s, designed to make anyone who entered feel entirely insignificant. Sheriff Vance Garrick pushed Maya Vance through the heavy iron intake door, her hands still locked tightly behind her back. He did not guide her gently. He shoved her forward, letting her shoulder strike the doorframe before she stumbled into the booking area. Deputy Tyler Briggs followed closely behind, carrying the remains of Maya's torn canvas bag like a trophy from a successful hunt. Sitting behind the raised booking desk was Deputy Nolan Cross. He was a young man, barely 25 years old, who had joined the department 2 years ago under the impression that he would be protecting his hometown. His uniform was immaculate, but his face lacked the hardened malice of his superiors. When he looked up and saw Maya, a tall, perfectly composed black woman in handcuffs, his eyes widened slightly. He immediately read the room. He saw the triumphant smirk on Garrick's face and the aggressive posture of Briggs. He had seen this ritual too many times before. "Process her, Cross," Garrick ordered, unclipping his heavy-duty belt and leaning against the booking desk with a heavy sigh. "Disorderly conduct, resisting, evading arrest, and whatever else I decide to write down on the affidavit later. Put her in the isolation cell at the back. The hot one." Cross swallowed hard, his throat dry. He looked at Maya, who stepped forward and stood directly in front of his desk. Even in handcuffs, with her clothes stained by the diner's spilled coffee, her posture remained perfectly erect. She did not look at him with anger. She looked at him with a piercing, analytical calm that made him feel completely transparent. "Ma'am, please step up to the counter," Cross said, his voice trembling slightly. Briggs dumped the contents of her bag onto the metal booking tray. Cross began sorting through her belongings to log them into the inventory system. He picked up her wallet, pulling out her driver's license, and then his fingers brushed against a heavy, laminated card beneath it. He pulled it out. It was a military identification card, crisp and authentic, bearing the official seal of the United States Department of Defense. Printed clearly beneath her photograph were the words, "Captain Maya Vance, Logistics Command, United States Army." Cross froze. His breath caught in his throat. He looked at the card, then looked up at Maya, his eyes wide with a sudden, paralyzing panic. He knew exactly what this meant. This was not a random out-of-town traveler they could terrify and discard. This was a high-ranking, active-duty military officer. "Sheriff," Cross stammered, his hands trembling as he held up the military ID card. "Sheriff, look at this. She's an active-duty captain in the Army." Garrick didn't even look up from his phone. He let out a loud, dismissive grunt. "I don't care if she thinks she's the Queen of England. Cross. In this county, she's a criminal who disobeyed my lawful order. Write it down as an alias if you have to. Now get her out of my sight." Cross looked back at the card, his face turning pale. He noticed her personal smartphone sitting on the tray. The screen suddenly lit up with an encrypted, high-level military notification. A red flashing icon indicated that an automated emergency security check-in had been missed, and a geo-tracking beacon had been activated. Cross felt a cold sweat break out across his neck. He wanted to speak up, to tell the sheriff that they were stepping onto a landmine, but the terrifying authority of Vance Garrick kept his mouth completely shut. Briggs grabbed Maya by the shoulder, twisting her around. "Let's go, Captain. Your new quarters are waiting." They dragged her down a long, dimly lit corridor to the very back of the facility. The isolation cell was a narrow box of solid concrete with a heavy steel door and a tiny, reinforced glass window. Garrick had purposely turned off the ventilation system in this section of the jail. The air inside the cell was suffocating, rising rapidly toward 40 degrees Celsius under the midday southern sun. It felt like an oven. Briggs unlocked her handcuffs, shoving her into the cell so hard she had to catch herself against the concrete wall. Before she could turn around, Briggs snatched the small bottle of prescription medication she had kept in her front pocket, her mandatory medication for an operational injury suffered during her deployment. "Hey, you can't take that," Maya said, her voice remaining firm but urgent. "That is prescribed medical treatment." Garrick stepped up to the steel door, a vicious, mocking smile stretching across his heavy face. He took the bottle from Briggs's hand, shaking it casually. "Prescribed medical treatment? Looks like suspected contraband to me, girl. We'll have to send this to the state lab for testing. Might take a few weeks. Until then, you can do without." Maya stepped toward the door, her eyes locking onto his through the narrow steel opening. "Sheriff Garrick, you are knowingly violating federal laws, denying medical care, and abusing your authority. You cannot keep me here without a formal arraignment." Garrick leaned his face close to the steel mesh, his voice dropping to a dangerous, venomous whisper. "You look at me with those quiet eyes all you want, but out there, you might be a big shot. In here, you are just another piece of colored street trash that I can erase with a stroke of my pen. Nobody is coming for you, and nobody cares if you rot. With a heavy metallic slam, the steel door closed, and the heavy bolt clicked into place. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Maya was left alone in the stifling heat, without her medication, without her phone, locked behind iron bars. But as she sat down on the narrow metal bench, she closed her eyes and began counting the minutes, knowing that the digital beacon on her phone had already sent a silent signal straight to the heart of the American military network. Deep within the secure corridors of the Army Material Command, located hundreds of miles away, a red light began to pulse on a high-resolution monitoring console. The facility was quiet, filled only with the low hum of advanced supercomputers and the quiet murmurs of intelligence analysts tracking global logistical operations. Suddenly, an automated audible ping echoed through the tactical room. A young communications technician stared at his screen, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he intercepted the signal. "Sir, we have an active automated emergency beacon from an elite logistics asset," he announced, his voice sharp with urgency. "It's Captain Maya Vance. She missed her mandatory high-level security check-in for the joint logistical briefing scheduled for 1300 hours. Her encrypted device has been forcibly disconnected, but her secondary geo-tracking beacon just pinged from a localized facility in Blackwood County, South Carolina." Within 90 seconds, the digital file was routed directly to the office of 4-star General Vance Carter. General Carter was a legendary figure within the United States military, a man of immense stature, with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen the battlefields of 3 separate decades. He commanded absolute respect from the highest levels of the Pentagon down to the rawest recruits. He was not just Maya's superior officer, he was her godfather, a man who had promised her father before he passed away that he would always watch over her. When Carter read the digital alert, his jaw clenched so hard, the muscles in his face turned to stone. His eyes locked onto the coordinates, a small rural county sheriff's station. "Get the governor of South Carolina on the secure line immediately," General Carter commanded, his voice vibrating with a quiet, terrifying rage that made the room fall silent. "Sir, the governor is currently in an international economic summit," his aide replied hesitantly. "His staff says it will take at least 2 hours to establish a secure connection." General Carter stood up from his heavy mahogany desk, straightening his uniform. The 4 silver stars on his shoulders caught the harsh fluorescent light of his office. 2 hours? "My captain is being held by a civilian law enforcement agency without cause. Her emergency locator is broadcasting a red alert, and they expect me to wait for a phone call? Cancel the schedule. Mobilize Tactical Transport Unit Alpha immediately." "Sir?" the aide stammered, his eyes wide. "That requires a direct operational order." "I am issuing the order," General Carter said, his voice hot. "We are deploying. If a local county sheriff thinks he can hijack an officer of the United States Army, he is about to find out exactly who owns the sky." Back in the sweltering cells of Blackwood County, Sheriff Vance Garrick was completely oblivious to the gathering storm. He sat in his air-conditioned office, his boots resting heavily on his wooden desk, laughing with Deputy Briggs. On the desk sat a plastic evidence bag containing a small package of white powder that Briggs had pulled from an old, unlogged narcotics locker in the basement. "We'll say we found this hidden in the lining of her canvas bag during the inventory search," Garrick said, tapping the plastic bag with his thick finger. "Possession with intent to distribute. That's a felony. Minimum 20 years in the state penitentiary. That ought to cure her of that high and mighty attitude." Deputy Nolan Cross stood by the doorway, his face pale, his hands trembling so violently he had to hide them behind his back. He couldn't breathe. He knew this was a massive, illegal frame-up. He knew that fabricating felony charges against an active-duty military officer was an act of treason against her constitutional rights. But the fear of Garrick's wrath kept him frozen in place. Garrick stood up, walking over to the cell block corridor. He peered through the narrow window of Maya's cell, watching her sit perfectly still in the oppressive, suffocating heat. He cracked the door open slightly, tossing the fabricated paperwork onto the floor of her cell. "Look at that, Captain," Garrick mocked, his voice dripping with triumphant malice. "Looks like my deputies found a massive amount of illegal narcotics in your vehicle. Your clean record just went up in smoke. Let's see how that quiet, arrogant mouth of yours handles 20 years in a maximum security prison cell. Nobody is coming to save you." Maya didn't look at the paperwork. She didn't look at his smug face. She simply looked up, her voice dropping to a cold, level tone that carried an eerie weight. "You should listen very closely, Sheriff. The silence you hear right now isn't peace. It's the calm before the storm. And you don't have enough room in your jail for what's coming." Garrick laughed loudly, slamming the steel door shut once more. He walked back to his desk, completely satisfied with his performance. He believed he was untouchable. He believed that the borders of Blackwood County would protect his corruption forever. He didn't know that high above the state line, the air was already vibrating with the rhythmic, earth-shattering thumping of twin T-700 military engines, heading directly for his coordinates with absolute vengeance. The quiet afternoon routine of Blackwood County was completely shattered at exactly 1400 hours. The sun was still beating down on the small town square, reflecting off the red brick courthouse and the dusty windows of the local businesses. Suddenly, a low, deep vibration began to ripple through the ground. It didn't start as a sound. It started as a tremor in the soles of the citizens' boots. In Miller's Oak Grill, the coffee inside the ceramic mugs began to ripple in perfect, rhythmic circles. Arthur Miller stopped cleaning the counter, looking up at the ceiling as the windows of his diner began to rattle violently within their metal frames. Within seconds, the low vibration turned into a deafening, earth-shattering roar. The sky above the town square suddenly darkened as a massive, dark green shadow descended from the clouds, blocking out the sun completely. It was a twin-engine, high-performance Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk military helicopter, bearing the unmistakable white star and bold markings of the United States Army. The sheer force of its massive rotor blades created a localized hurricane in the center of the small town, sending clouds of dust, gravel, and trash cans flying across the asphalt. Now, here is the incredible part. The massive military aircraft didn't look for an airport or a wide highway. It descended directly over the small, narrow roof of the Blackwood County Sheriff's Department station itself. The pilot, executing an impossibly precise tactical maneuver, brought the massive helicopter down until its heavy landing gear rested perfectly on the structural beams of the station's roof. The old tin roofing groaned under the immense weight, and the ceiling tiles inside the sheriff's office immediately began to crack and shatter, raining white dust down onto the floor. Inside the station, the scene was absolute chaos. Sheriff Vance Garrick leaped out of his chair, his face turning pale as his desk lamp fell over, and his framed campaign posters shattered against the walls. "What the hell is happening?" he screamed, his voice completely drowned out by the thunderous roar of the engines directly above his head. Deputy Briggs drew his service weapon, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it onto the floor. "Sheriff, there's a military chopper on the roof. It's right on top of us." The front glass doors of the station were suddenly thrown open as a team of heavily armed United States military police, wearing full tactical gear, combat helmets, and carrying standard-issue rifles, entered the lobby. They moved with flawless, terrifying discipline, instantly securing the perimeter, blocking every exit, and disarming Deputy Briggs before he could even process what was happening. They didn't speak to the local deputies. They simply pushed them back against the walls, creating a secure path from the entrance directly to the center of the room. The room fell dead silent. Nobody dared to breathe. The local deputies stood frozen, their mouths open, paralyzed by the realization that their small-town authority had just been completely obliterated by a superior force. Through the front doors stepped four-star General Vance Carter. He was an imposing vision of absolute military authority, his dress uniform immaculate, his chest covered in rows of colorful combat ribbons, and the 4 silver stars on his shoulders gleaming under the flickering, damaged lights of the station lobby. He walked with a slow, unyielding stride, his combat boots striking the floor with a rhythmic, terrifying precision that made Sheriff Garrick's heart skip a beat. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated steel. Garrick tried to step forward, his voice cracking as he attempted to use his official title, General, Sir. This is a localized civilian law enforcement jurisdiction. You can't just land a military aircraft on my roof. We are executing a standard criminal investigation. General Carter did not stop walking until he was standing inches from Garrick's face. The sheer physical presence of the 4-star general made the barrel-chested sheriff look small, weak, and entirely pathetic. Carter looked down at Garrick's uniform badge, his eyes narrowing with a disgust so profound it felt like a physical weight in the room. Your jurisdiction? General Carter's voice was low, but it vibrated through the concrete walls of the station like thunder. You have exactly 60 seconds to bring Captain Maya Vance into this lobby, unharmed and completely cleared of your fabricated charges, or I will dismantle this entire facility brick by brick under the authority of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Your little kingdom just ended, Sheriff. Garrick's hands began to tremble violently. The arrogant, untouchable dictator who had ruled Blackwood County for 3 terms disappeared, replaced by a terrified, cornered coward who could see his entire life falling off a cliff. He looked at Briggs, who was already on his knees, with his hands behind his head, and then his eyes darted toward the cell block corridor, where the true consequences of his corruption were waiting to be revealed. The dust kicked up by the Black Hawk's massive rotors slowly began to settle in the small town square. But inside the lobby of the Blackwood County Sheriff's Department, the air remained completely unbreathable. The thunderous hum of the twin T-700 engines on the roof vibrated through the floorboards, a constant reminder of the raw federal power hovering directly over Sheriff Vance Garrick's head. General Vance Carter stood like an unmovable statue of granite, his arms folded behind his back, his sharp eyes pinned to the trembling lawman. The 4 silver stars on his collar caught the light of the flickering, damaged fluorescent tubes that had been shaken loose from the ceiling. I am waiting, civilian, General Carter said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly tone that carried more weight than a judge's gavel. The 60 seconds are ticking, and I do not like to be kept waiting by men who abuse the uniform of this country. Garrick's mouth opened, but only a dry, stuttering gasp came out. His throat felt like it was coated in sand. He turned his head slowly, looking for Deputy Briggs, but his loyal shadow was currently pinned against the concrete wall by 2 heavily armed military police officers, his service weapon confiscated, and his face pressed flat against the drywall. Garrick's eyes then darted toward the booking desk, where young Deputy Nolan Cross was sitting. Cross did not wait for an order. The sheer terror of the situation had finally broken through the wall of fear that had kept him subservient to Garrick's corrupt regime for 2 years. He stood up so fast, his metal chair screeched across the floor and flipped over backward. His hands were shaking violently, but his movements were deliberate. He grabbed the heavy brass keyring from the intake hook and pulled Maya's pristine military identification card out of the evidence tray. "Sir! General, sir!" Cross shouted, his voice cracking with anxiety as he sprinted around the counter, bypassing Sheriff Garrick entirely. He dropped to one knee before General Carter, holding out the laminated ID card and the heavy keys with both hands, like a formal surrender. "She's in the back, sir. The isolation cell. The sheriff ordered us to turn off the air conditioning and take her prescription medication. We framed her, sir. It was all fabricated. I have the logs right here." "Cross, shut your traitorous mouth!" Garrick roared, his face flashing from pale white to a deep, dangerous purple as his desperation turned into sudden rage. He reached down instinctively toward his heavy leather holster, his fingers wrapping around the handle of his service pistol. He didn't even manage to unclip the safety strap. In a fraction of a second, The two military police officers standing flanking General Carter moved with terrifying, combat-trained speed. The distinctive metallic clack of two standard-issue rifles being brought to bear echoed through the lobby. The barrels were pointed directly at Garrick's chest. "Step away from the weapon, civilian." The lead MP barked, his voice an absolute wall of authority. "Touch that holster again, and you will be neutralized immediately as an active threat to federal personnel." Garrick froze. His hand snapped away from his hip, as if the leather holster had suddenly turned to red-hot iron. He raised his palms into the air, sweat pouring down his forehead in thick, heavy streams, soaking the collar of his neatly pressed uniform shirt. The room fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. Nobody moved. Nobody dared to breathe. General Carter didn't even flinch at the movement. He didn't look at Garrick's gun. He simply looked at Deputy Cross, taking the military ID card from the young man's trembling fingers. His expression softened slightly, recognizing the genuine remorse in the young officer's eyes. "Bring her out," General Carter commanded Cross flatly. "Now." Cross scrambled to his feet and sprinted down the dark, sweltering corridor toward the isolation cells. The heavy steel door of the rear cell block groaned as he threw it open. Inside the tiny, suffocating concrete box, the temperature had risen past 40 degrees Celsius. Maya Vance sat on the narrow iron bench, her charcoal gray polo shirt damp with sweat, but her back remained perfectly straight, her hands resting calmly on her knees. When Cross unlocked the heavy steel bolt, the door swung open with a loud, echoey clang. "Captain Vance, ma'am," Cross breathed, his face flushed with heat and panic. "You're free. General Carter is here. He's in the lobby." Maya stood up slowly, stretching her tall frame. She didn't look surprised. She didn't run. She walked out of the cell block with the slow, disciplined stride of an officer marching onto a parade deck. She stepped over the fabricated narcotics paperwork that Garrick had tossed onto the floor, leaving it behind like worthless trash. As she entered the bright light of the main lobby, General Carter turned to face her. For the first time since the helicopter had touched down on the roof, the iron mask on the general's face cracked, revealing a deep, protective anger. He stepped forward, his boots clicking sharply on the linoleum, and brought his right hand up to his brow in a perfect, formal military salute. "Captain Vance," General Carter said, his voice echoing through the silent station. "Your logistical briefing has been delayed. I believe we have some unfinished business to settle in this county first." Maya returned the salute with flawless precision, her hand steady against her brow. "Reporting for duty, General," she said, her voice completely level, completely unbowed by the hours spent in the dark oven of the jail cell. She looked past his shoulder, her eyes locking onto the pathetic, sweating figure of Sheriff Vance Garrick, whose entire world was crumbling into dust before him. The power dynamic inside the Blackwood County Sheriff's Department had completely turned. Sheriff Vance Garrick, who just 1 hour ago had stood inside Miller's Oak Grill, declaring himself the supreme law of the land, was now standing with his hands held high in the air, surrounded by federal soldiers. His chest, which usually puffed out with immense pride, was shallow and shaking as he struggled to find his breath in the suffocating tension of his own lobby. General Carter turned his back on the sheriff, focusing entirely on Maya. "Captain, I see your uniform and equipment have been desecrated. I want a full verbal report of every action taken against an officer of the United States military under color of law." Maya stood at perfect attention, her voice ringing out through the quiet room with the cold, precise clarity of a court reporter. At approximately 0900 hours, Sheriff Garrick initiated an unlawful traffic stop on Interstate 95 based on a fabricated lane change violation. When I requested standard documentation, he used racial slurs and threatened physical violence. I moved to a public establishment, Miller's Oak Grill, to ensure the presence of civilian witnesses. Garrick tried to interrupt, his voice thin and desperate. "General, she was non-compliant. She refused a lawful search." General Carter didn't even turn his head. He simply raised one finger, and the MP officer closest to Garrick stepped forward, pressing the barrel of his rifle directly against the sheriff's heavy chest, forcing him back against the wooden booking desk. "Keep your mouth shut, civilian," the soldier growled. Maya continued her report without a single pause. Inside the diner, Sheriff Garrick and Deputy Briggs illegally seized my personal property without a warrant. Deputy Briggs destroyed my canvas travel bag, and Sheriff Garrick took my Bronze Star medal from its casing, tossed it onto the floor, and intentionally crushed it beneath his boot while declaring that people of my color belong in a cage. They then used excessive force to restrain me, causing boiling coffee to be spilled across my clothes and equipment before processing me into this facility under completely fabricated felony charges of narcotics possession. When the words Bronze Star Medal left Maya's mouth, the temperature in the room seemed to drop below freezing. The military personnel in the lobby tightened their grips on their weapons, their eyes turning into slits of pure, unadulterated fury. To a soldier, the desecration of a combat medal was an act of war. General Carter walked slowly over to the booking desk. He picked up the plastic evidence bag containing the white powder that Briggs had placed there earlier. He held it up to the light, then looked at Deputy Cross. "Officer, what is this substance?" Cross looked directly at Garrick, completely ignoring the sheriff's venomous glare. "That is old contraband from our unlogged evidence locker, sir." Sheriff Garrick ordered Deputy Briggs to place it in her file to ensure she would face a mandatory 20-year sentence. He wanted to make sure nobody would come looking for her. General Carter tossed the plastic bag back onto the desk. It landed with a soft, pathetic thud. He then turned his full, terrifying attention back to Vance Garrick. He stepped so close that the silver stars on his shoulders brushed against the sheriff's dirty badge. "You are a coward, Garrick," General Carter said, his voice a dangerous whisper that cut through the silence like a razor blade. "You hid behind a piece of tin on your chest and a gun on your hip to terrorize citizens who didn't look like you. You thought that because this town was small, the world outside couldn't see your rotten behavior, but the United States military sees you. The Department of Justice sees you. And right now, the ground beneath your feet is completely gone." At that exact moment, the front doors of the station were thrown open again. This time, it wasn't more soldiers. Two men in sharp, dark blue suits with federal credentials pinned to their jackets entered the lobby, followed by 4 state highway patrol captains. They were agents from the South Carolina State Law Enforcement Division and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, alerted directly by the Pentagon. The lead FBI agent walked straight to Garrick. He didn't offer a greeting. He pulled a heavy leather folder from his jacket, flipping it open to reveal a federal arrest warrant signed by a circuit judge under the authority of the Civil Rights Division. "Vance Garrick," the agent stated flatly, his voice echoing through the ruined lobby. "You are under arrest for deprivation of civil rights, under color of law, federal witness intimidation, and conspiracy to fabricate evidence. Lower your hands and place them behind your back." Garrick's jaw dropped. He looked around the room, looking at the ceiling tiles that were still dripping dust onto his shoulders, looking at Briggs, who was weeping quietly against the wall, and finally looking at Maya Vance, who stood completely still, her head held high, watching his kingdom collapse into absolute nothingness. The sun began to set over Blackwood County, casting long, dark shadows across the town square. But the lights inside the sheriff's department never turned back on. The building was officially sealed as a federal crime scene. Outside in the gravel parking lot, a massive crowd of local citizens had gathered, standing behind the yellow police tape that had been put up by the State Highway Patrol. Among them stood Arthur Miller, his apron still stained with coffee, his eyes wide as he watched the historic events unfold before his town. Next to him were the retirees, the local store owners, and the dozens of black residents who had spent decades keeping their heads down, terrified of the man who had ruled their lives from behind a badge. The front glass doors of the station swung open one final time. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the flashbulbs of a regional news crew began to pop in rapid succession. Sheriff Vance Garrick was led out onto the concrete steps. His hands were not resting heavily on his pistol holster anymore. They were secured tightly behind his back in a pair of heavy, standard-issue iron handcuffs. His head was bowed, his mirrored aviator sunglasses gone, revealing the hollow, terrified eyes of a man who had finally been stripped of his stolen power. He was forced down the steps by two federal agents, his heavy boots shuffling lamely along the asphalt. Behind him came Deputy Tyler Briggs, his uniform wrinkled and his face wet with tears, completely broken by the reality of his own actions. They were paraded past the very billboard at the county edge that claimed Sheriff Dawson keeps Blackwood safe. The crowd remained completely silent as the two corrupt lawmen were pushed into the back seat of an unmarked federal sedan, the heavy doors slamming shut with a finality that sounded like a prison vault, closing forever. Within 72 hours of the arrest, the United States Department of Justice opened a massive structural pattern and practice investigation into the entire Blackwood County Sheriff's Department. It wasn't just a routine review. It was a total federal takeover with full subpoena power. Once the fear of Vance Garrick was removed from the town, the silence that had protected his corruption for 12 years completely shattered. On Monday morning, a local mechanic called the federal hotline. By Wednesday afternoon, a young mother came forward. By the end of the month, 14 separate formal complaints had been filed by Black residents, all describing the exact same terrifying playbook. A young high school student who had been held in a cruiser for 40 minutes while walking home in his uniform because his face looked suspicious. A local business owner whose store had been searched 3 times in 2 months without a warrant until he agreed to pay a safety donation to the sheriff's campaign fund. The data analysts from the DOJ pulled the county records, revealing that black drivers were 4 times more likely to be stopped and searched per capita than white drivers over the last 3 years. It wasn't a series of honest mistakes. It was a deliberate, systemic machine designed to ensure a specific part of the population never felt comfortable in their own homes. The trial of Vance Garrick lasted 9 grueling days in the federal courthouse in Atlanta. The defense tried everything, arguing that Garrick was a dedicated lawman who had simply used overzealous methods to keep his rural county safe from outsiders. They claimed it was a misunderstanding, a routine traffic stop that had escalated due to tension. But the jury didn't buy a single word. On day 3, Captain Maya Vance took the witness stand in her full-dress olive-drab uniform, her silver oak leaves gleaming, and her rows of combat medals pinned perfectly to her chest. She delivered her testimony with the exact same quiet, unbreakable composure she had maintained inside the sweltering isolation cell. She laid out the facts like a master strategist building a fortress, 1 brick at a time, completely unmovable and impossible to tear down. On day 5, young Deputy Nolan Cross took the stand, presenting the deleted computer logs and the unlogged evidence locker records that proved the narcotics had been intentionally planted. Deputy Briggs, facing a mandatory 12-year sentence for conspiracy, took a cooperation deal within 48 hours and spent an entire day on the stand naming specific dates, specific victims, and direct quotes from Vance Garrick, including the infamous phrase, "Find a reason to make them uncomfortable." The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. The verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. Federal Judge Harold Whitfield looked down at Garrick from his high bench before reading the final sentence. "The badge you wore was entrusted to you by every single citizen of Blackwood County," Judge Whitfield said, his voice echoing through the crowded courtroom. "Not some of them, Garrick. All of them. You weaponized that sacred trust against the very people you swore an oath to protect. You believed that your uniform made you a god within your county line. This court cannot undo the years of terror you inflicted on this community, but it can ensure you never wear a badge or carry a weapon for the rest of your natural life." The sentence was devastating. 11 years in a federal maximum security prison, total forfeiture of his county pension, and a lifetime ban from any form of law enforcement service. Garrick was led out of the courtroom in the exact same chains he had used to humiliate Maya Vance, his shuffling boots marking the end of his tyrannical reign. 6 months after the verdict, Blackwood County signed a mandatory consent decree with the federal government. The terms were absolute and non-negotiable. Every officer was fitted with a mandatory body camera that could never be deactivated during a shift. A civilian oversight board with full subpoena power was established, with half of its members appointed by local community organizations, not the county council. Regular bias audits were conducted by an independent federal firm every 6 months, with the results published openly on a public website. The department was rebuilt from the gravel up. In November, the town held its first contested sheriff election in 12 years. The winner was a 41-year-old former state trooper who ran on a platform of total transparency and structural accountability. She won the seat by 11 points. A small, quiet ceremony was held at the courthouse to honor the courage of the citizens who had spoken up. Maya Vance did not attend the media interviews or post about the victory on social media. She was already back at her post at the Pentagon, her notebook open, her focus returned to the defense of her country. But inside Miller's Oak Grill, something beautiful had changed. Arthur Miller had gone into his storage room and brought out a small, framed photograph. It showed Captain Maya Vance standing proudly beside her elderly grandmother, both of them smiling under the bright South Carolina sun. He hung the frame directly behind the counter, right where everyone could see it as they walked through the door. The old nail hole where Garrick's campaign poster had hung was gone, covered by a symbol of true, unyielding dignity that could never be locked away. This powerful story reminds us that true human dignity can never be locked behind iron bars or stripped away by a corrupt uniform. Power is temporary, but justice and honor are eternal. When we choose to speak up against injustice, we shine a light into the darkest corners of our world. If this journey moved your heart, please drop a comment below with your thoughts, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and hit that subscribe button with the notification bell turned on so you never miss our stories of absolute truth.